Hey y'all. So we're in week 3 now, believe it or not. And I'm going to do the first lecture right now. I'm going to try and break this up to make them shorter if I can, because if they're really long, I don't think you guys watch it all. I know I probably wouldn't. So we're going to do that. So today we're going to be talking about a little bit more about study designs, how study designs can impact our analysis for infectious disease, and talking about some more basics and focusing particularly on transmission dynamics. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I got to do it this way because I can't see the slides that are coming up. So here we go. So week 3, lecture 1, study designs continued. But first I want to talk about the epidemic curve. And this is like really, part of what makes infectious disease fascinating is how different it is from any other types of classical or traditional epidemiology. And the epidemic curve is one thing that does not exist in chronic disease epidemiology. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why. So particularly since COVID-19 has started, we've heard a lot about flattening the curve. I'm sure you've all heard that at this point. But there's really little discussion about what the curve actually is. News organizations present pictures like what we have here. And this is from CBC of a curve. We have days since first case. Here's time on the x-axis, and the y-axis is daily cases, and everything goes up and then goes down. What does that mean? And then what does it mean to have an intervention and have it quote flatten, as they say? So we're going to explore these concepts a little more deeply later in the course, but I kind of want to introduce you to them to get you familiar with the sort of basic ideas and some terminology that I'm going to keep going back to when I'm talking about infectious disease and transmission dynamics. So when we talk about infectious diseases in general, not for all infectious diseases, but in general for a generic infectious disease that, for example, has an infectious period and people recover and then develop immunity and all these things. We have three different states that people go through. And the first is a bin of susceptibles. And these are the people who have not been infected yet, but have the potential to be infected upon exposure. And then when they're exposed, they become infected. So they move into the infected category. It's people who are currently infected and potentially infectious. And again, this is a generic infectious disease. Doesn't apply to all of them. And then after a period of being infected and being infectious, they recover. And these are people who have been infected in the past, but are no longer diseased and can no longer transmit. So they're fully recovered. So an example of this kind of disease, a disease like this would be something like measles, where people are born, they're susceptible, they haven't had it yet, or they've not had it in their life, in their adult life. And then they become infected, they become infectious to other people. And then after a period of infectiousness, if they don't die, they recover. So these people, they're no longer able to transmit, they're no longer to be infected. So, and it has to be mentioned that in the recovered state, this could also include people who died. I mean, people can exit the whole system. And so what we see is a bin of susceptible people. This is like most of us for COVID-19 right now. And then they're infected. They move into this infected bin, and then eventually they recover. And so this is a simple susceptible infected recovered model. So what we call an SIR model. You're going to hear me say that a lot over the course of the course. But what you've got to understand here is that what you're going to notice here is that as more people become infected and recover, the number of susceptible people decreases. I'm going to fix this and put this in a plural. Decreases, and thus the number of infected people at any time decreases as well. So you're pulling people out of the susceptible bin. The susceptible bin becomes fewer and fewer and fewer people, and the recoverers become more. And obviously there's less people to be infected, so the infected goes down as well. And that's where you get this curve from. So at first, we start out, we have a fully susceptible population. Infection starts happening. You get lots and lots and lots of infections. People start to recover. There's fewer and fewer susceptible people in the population. And thus, the number of candidate people to become infected goes down. So the number of infections eventually starts going down as well. That's what we're talking about when we talk about this curve. And later in the course, we're going to have a whole session on transmission modeling, disease modeling. But I just wanted to sort of give you an idea of what this epidemic curve means, sort of mechanistically, and introduce you to some of these terms. So many susceptible people at first. People are infected, number of infections goes up, and eventually people start recovering. There's fewer susceptibles and thus fewer infections. And so eventually goes down and hopefully dies out as the number of susceptible people dwindles, close to zero, so that there's less opportunities for transmission overall. So some general themes regarding disease transmission. Obviously, we have time, place, and person. This is sort of the bread and butter of epidemiology, the things that we're interested in. There's obviously, unknown disease periods and corresponding recall biases. But we're going to move on from there to epi curves and what this means. We've already talked a little bit about what epi curves are. I've given you that SIR model. A little bit later, we're going to talk about spatial epidemiology because that's kind of my specialty. And talk about case control studies, case studies, cohort studies, all these different kinds of studies and how this has something to do with the epidemic curve and exposure and outcome measurements. And then later in the course, we're going to talk about lab techniques, diagnostic biases. Many pathogens have their own disease-specific designs and issues. They're all different, really. And the environment, vectors, and hosts may all need to be sampled and explored in their own ways to make this all more complicated for us. But we're going to talk about that later. So the epidemic curve, it looks quite simple, but the epidemic curve and the shape of it can provide important information, including outliers, is the cases that stand apart from the overall pattern, sort of weird, isolated events, a general sense of the magnitude of the epidemic, inferences about the outbreak's mode of spread. The shape can tell us something about that, and backtracking to the most likely period of exposure. And we can also get sort of a sense of dynamics of the infection itself. So here we've got a generic disease. We don't know what this is. Here's time, month of onset, and cases over time. And it goes up, goes down, right? And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about a minute ago. So point source transmission. This is like a bunch of people go to a restaurant, they eat some food that is infected with something, contaminated with something. They become infected with some sort of enteric pathogen. There's lots and lots of cases, and then it kind of dwindles out because this was all related to one point source. All cases came from that one single source. This is the most common form of epicurve from foodborne diseases. If any of you end up working in public health, local public health departments, you'll see this all the time. Somebody, didn't use the right temperature of water to clean dishes or whatever, didn't boil the soup at a proper temperature, served expired meats, all different kinds of things, or somebody came to work sick, whatever. But sort of foodborne pathogens, foodborne diseases, this is the sort of pattern you see. A large population is exposed for a short period of time. Continuing common source transmission. And so this is when transmission sort of keeps occurring from a common source, and maybe like the duration of exposure, of infectiousness at that particular source is long. And so new sets of people keep coming in, like when we think about the Broad Street pump in London that John Snow so heroically turned off, people were continuously exposed to that water until he turned it off. And so you'd see, these sort of like peaks over time. The incubation period here is very muddy. We kind of don't really get a sense of how long it takes for cases to appear because people are being repeatedly exposed. Worth noting that here, in this point source transmission, we get some sort of indication of time from exposure to onset of disease from this curve, and it looks like about 4 days in this case. In general, it can depend on the individual. So that's one thing we can also conclude from this. Here is very muddy. It's hard to say because we've got all these like weird peaks going on, and that could be related to number of people coming into that particular restaurant over time, or number of people accessing the Broad Street pump back in London in the 1800s. Propagated transmission. This is when there is some sort of localized, continual transmission over a period of time. Here we have months over some set of years. I don't quite know. Oh, this is measles. Okay, this is measles. And so we see, in October of 1970 to November, it's really not a whole lot going on. And then these peaks start happening. And these waves are expanding over time, which means transmission is cyclic but ramping up, and then sort of dwindles off for whatever reason. And this would be, an epidemic, but not sort of continuous sustained transmission over a very, very long period of time, like something we'd see for influenza. This would be an outbreak, and then there's secondary transmission between individuals following this outbreak. Vector-borne transmission starts very slowly, often because the vectors themselves need time to reproduce and access humans, for example, for blood meals for reproduction, and then populations of the vector increase over time. So it can start slowly. Time between first case and the peak is comparable to the combined incubation periods. Slow tail. Drags off. Environmental conditions may cause surge in vectors into a crash. So you think here, is the beginning of spring when mosquitoes start coming out. Mosquito population increases, so transmission of malaria, for example, increases. And then as the weather cools down again, the mosquito populations are decreasing. So you often see these sort of seasonal patterns with vector-borne diseases all around. Because the vectors themselves are subject to seasonal pressures. Cholera. Heterogeneity can mask the details here. So we've got a beginning of transmission here at May 9th. And again, number of cases on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. Persons with a short incubation period of 1 day are infected on the 9th of May. And then these cases come out here. Transmission ends at this point, and then persons with long incubation periods of 5 days infected on the 14th of May. So transmission is stopped here, but because incubation periods can vary by individual, we get some stragglers out here. So you see sort of a pattern here, but because of these sort of inconsistencies within individuals, the curve itself can hide some of this. We don't have that information just by looking at this. If data exist, my personal professional view is that they should be used. You collect data of any kind, definitely get it out there. Unless it's fake data, then definitely don't get it out there. But none of us would ever do that because that's bad. Definitely no one do that. Kind of making this a little more legible here. So this is a plot of the epidemic curve of salmonella back in 1984. Supper, snack, flight times. this is time over time in hours. Salmonella's infection incubation period is quite short. You generally know you have it within a few hours, and then goes up. And this was tracked back to the snack time, where, supper time, snack time. I'm not sure. I actually don't know this data, so I'm not sure exactly what happened here. But the point is like, if you have even some kind of limited data like this with just a handful of cases, we can glean a little bit of information and draw some conclusions about this. In this case, we're associating all those salmonella cases with a particular mealtime on an airplane. So in summary, point source looks like this, epicurve looks like this, continuous source looks like this with all these regular spikes. Propagated source can have a increase of cases at the beginning, then maybe nothing, and then increases again over time, increasing over time, and then maybe dying out. Then intermittent source can be just random, epidemics, random outbreaks at different points in time, because people are contracting it at different places. Keep in mind, of course, that many data quality issues exist. No data is perfect. We're seeing that the general population of the US is all of a sudden fascinated with mortality recording on death certificates, or cause of death recording on death certificates. And they're realizing that data is not necessarily the best in a lot of cases. So, even for us as professional epidemiologists, we have to be aware that there's always limitations of data, and should be any result should be taken with any caveats and qualifications we might need. So the data issues can impact the shapes of these curves, is what the point is. So when we draw conclusions from the shapes of these curves, we always have to be, take it somewhat with a grain of salt. It's not always hard evidence. Some pointers. Epidemic curves are basically just histograms with no gaps and boxes for cases. X-axis scale is time, and the interval is important. Generally, we want to set it at between 1/4 and a half of the incubation period. Stata, epicurve, and R have 2 packages for this: EpiTools and epicurve. Honestly, I don't know what SAS does with this. SAS is, not necessarily specialized for epidemiology, though it's used a lot for epidemiology. There's a lot of macros that are available for it. R has packages that are specifically available for this, and we'll explore that later in the course. But all epicurves are common. They have time, cases, and there's no breaks. So here's real and important data about the Ebola outbreak in the DRC in January 2019, confirmed and probable. And so what we see here is these 2 sort of spikes. And so I guess, ask you, what sort of transmission would you think it would be? I mean, looking at this and looking at this, what could this be? I would say propagated source. That's what it looks like to me. Propagated source transmission. Look at this. We have, an outbreak here, and these increasing cycles of cases out here. That's exactly what we see in this case as well. This is real data. Ebola virus disease cases in different affected health zones in the Democratic Republic of Congo by week of illness onset. And these are different regions. And you can see that the pattern differs between regions, but when you put it all together, it can look like something else. So you have to be a little bit careful, because when you break things down and get more details, then the story becomes a little bit different. And I'll leave it to you to sort of guess at what all these things are. And here's a map of the area with the different cases and where they appeared and when they appeared. And I'll let you explore this later. Okay, so that was our first lecture on epi curves. Hope you enjoyed that. If you have questions, please, email myself or Tia. We're happy to clear anything up that might not make sense. Also, you can put things in the discussion on Moodle. And so I'm going to move on to lecture 2.